All right, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. Thank you for rating and reviewing us on iTunes. Thank you for supporting us at patreon.com/Matt Lewis. Thank you for subscribing to youtube.com/Matt Lewis. Happy to welcome back today friend of the show, David Frum. He's a staff writer at The Atlantic. He's the author of Trumpocalypse. David Frum, welcome back to the news.
Happy New Year. Such a pleasure to have to be back with you.
Good to see you. I got a bunch of stuff to talk about today, but I want to start with the debt ceiling, which, I guess we've put it off maybe till June or something, but it's not going to go away. This is looming over our heads like a sort of Damocles. And my take on it, David, is that I am more than willing to believe that spending is a problem. I just don't think Republicans have the credibility to tell us that again after what we've been through. But what's your take on this?
Well, there's a way to deal with spending, which is there's a budget process. Write a budget, show where you want to make your reductions or your reductions in the growth path. Put it into the political process. See how it goes. It's not like there isn't a way for people who have a majority in the House of Representatives to shape the future trend of federal spending. And yes, of course, if you don't have the Senate and you don't have the presidency, then that majority in the House of Representatives has to negotiate and won't get things all its own way. On the other hand, they might reflect that there was a period when they did have the majority in the Senate and the House and the presidency. And if they had ambitious plans, they could have done them then. I think the lesson of the lesson of the first two Trump years is Republican spending plans actually aren't all that ambitious.
Right, which undermines the premise that this is an existential threat, that we have to tackle the debt or it's going to tackle us. Like, if that was true, then you would have addressed it when you had the power to. So I think it really erodes, honestly, the seriousness potentially of the debt.
Yeah, no, look, the problem is genuinely worse than it was during the Trump years for this reason. And everyone who's got a mortgage that is about to reset will understand this, that a debt that looks manageable when interest rates are 1 or 2% can look very different when interest rates are 5 or 6%. But when Paul Ryan was warning back in 2011 that we were heading toward an existential debt crisis, that's what he had in mind. There would come a moment when the interest rates would rise and what had been manageable would very rapidly become unmanageable. So that's a real problem. And even though his prediction was off by a decade, it's not false. So yeah, something is going to have to be done in this new higher interest rate environment that's probably going to be with us for a while. Is that thing the blowing up of the world financial system? However, wouldn't that make things worse rather than better?
I wonder if Democrats would be willing to negotiate. We have seen probably a lot more bipartisan deals than most people would assume based on the talk about polarization. I wonder if Republicans, instead of trying to engage in sort of the brinksmanship of the debt ceiling, if they actually tried to negotiate, and I think Republicans would have to give some stuff away too. That's probably where maybe that's the deal breaker. Could this be done?
You can't negotiate when you don't know what you want. Or won't admit to yourself what you want. So, look, if you were serious about negotiation, the budget process is where you would do the negotiating. And there is one. And although we don't seem to write formal budgets anymore in the way that we used to, I mean, the continuing resolutions and things like that are also part of the budget process. All of those things could be done. I think what is driving this is not a concern about spending, because this is the wrong venue for that. What is driving that is there's a kind of buildup of emotional energy in the Republican Party, that a lot of it, which is left over from the battle over the 2020 election, which Republicans are now having to admit, okay, what the things we said weren't true. There's no excuse for January 2021. The election was not rigged or stolen, except we didn't like it that that Mark Zuckerberg gave money to some good causes. We're mad about that. But the whole Trump thing was a fantasy, but we're still mad. We're still really mad. And we have to pour that energy somewhere. And so we have to have a confrontation over something. And we don't care what it is. We just have to have this confrontation. And we don't actually have any goals. That's the beauty of the debt ceiling negotiation, is it's maximal drama. with minimal content, and that's what they're looking for. But I have a piece going up in the Atlantic today that is predicting or suggesting that one of the angles of this that Republicans have not thought through is what will they do when Donald Trump stabs them in the back in the debt ceiling fight?
Well, they want to do it by debt fraud and abuse, but if you really want to fix the debt problem, there's not enough money in waste, fraud, and abuse, right? So you have to do something. You have to go after defense spending, or like I saw, by the way, in France, there's protests. They want to raise. Did you see this, David? They want to raise the retirement age from 62 to 64 gradually, and
Yes,
then people are in the streets
yes.
protesting it. And but if we wanted to do something like entitlement reform, where we maybe raise the retirement age here, that would probably result in Donald Trump attacking Republicans.
He's
Is
going to
that
attack them.
that's
He's going to attack them over the debt ceiling, actually, because the numbers are the poll numbers are going to turn bad. And remember, one of Donald Trump's methods is to devour his internal party opponents. And Kevin McCarthy is not someone who is on Donald Trump's popularity parade. They've worked out a modus vivendi, but he will enjoy humiliating him. Can I say something on behalf of the French strikers? Because this is a story that Americans joke about, but I don't think we really well understand what's going on here and what the problem is. And it is a free market point, but it's not the one that's obviously made. In France, it's quite difficult to fire people. That means it's very difficult. That means employers are naturally reluctant to hire people. And that means that French workers, although they have a big chunk of holiday in the year, when they are at work extremely hard. And they have very high productivity numbers. And if you've ever been in a French cafe, here's a way to dramatize it. If you go to an American restaurant that's pretty fancy in some fancy part of Los Angeles or New York, where they're charging $8 to bring a cup of hot chocolate to the table, that kind of place, there will be one person who takes your order, one person who delivers your food, and one person who takes away the dirty cup. And there'll be another person whom you will not see who's in the kitchen who's washing the dirty cup. In a French restaurant, that's one person who does all those jobs. It's the same person. And if you watch him, he is running off his feet because that cafe has much less staff than its American counterpart because the difficulty of firing makes them reluctant to hire. Result, when that guy who's been running off his feet from 22 years old or younger hits 62, he's done. He is done. And the idea he's got a non-crazy complaint about asking him to do that job for 2 more years. But it's not because he's being ground by the jackboot of capitalism. It's because he's working in places that are persistently understaffed because of the difficulty of French laws about firing people.
Well, I will say, David, they take food seriously. It is a profession, and not just at the Michelin star rated restaurants. I mean, I was at a like an airport, sort of like an airport Marriott. I wasn't a Marriott, but it was something like that. It was like a random hotel by an airport near like Disney France or Euro Disney or whatever. Not a glamorous spot, it's like an hour outside of Paris or something like that. The food was unbelievable. Like
Yes.
the food at this, like, if this was America, you would have been getting maybe Eggo waffles and something like that. They took it so seriously. So I do. It's kind of apples and oranges, I guess.
The people need to. There was an op-ed in the New York Times that asked, "Are the French lazy?" And as your example, I mean, they work very hard, and their productivity numbers are very high. But they have built a system where they, because they are basically furloughing so much of their population that the people who do work have to work very hard, and they've built then this failure machine. And the answer is, I think that the answer is you can't do, and this is a lesson for us too. If you're going to do macroeconomic reforms, meaning budget and spending, you also have to do microeconomic reforms to make your economy more productive. So people don't experience necessary changes as just loss; they also can see gain, and that's something that is a good lesson for France or for the United States. I mean, it just strikes me as bizarre. We have these debates about the debt ceiling and about taxes. But what would put a lot of money in a lot of Americans' pockets is if we could squeeze some of the waste out of healthcare spending. And the defense budget is something you can cut, but the single biggest, because it's visible, there's a line, and you can measure it. But the single biggest burden, I think, on most American households is the extraordinary cost of healthcare, and that includes elder care. And one of the things that Republicans were supposed to do is come up with some ideas for bringing some economic rationality to the system. They've been promising that for now 20 plus years, a quarter of 15, nearly 15 years. When does that happen? That's real work that needs to be done.
I can tell you too, there have been a couple really good stories lately. There was a piece in the New York Times yesterday about how parents these days put in like way more time into their kids than our parents put into us, and the stress that it puts on families. And Megan McArdle had a really good piece over at the Washington Post about how you can make $400,000 living in Washington D.C., and if you've got a few kids, you're basically broke. And it's really almost impossible to get anybody to feel sorry for someone making that much money. But it really is true that there are people making that much money in the Washington, D.C. area who are essentially living paycheck to paycheck, um, who are really, in a way, struggling. And it just strikes me like our economy is so different, and our world is so different from a couple of generations ago.
Well, that's, I think, not about that's. Megan there is, I think, fusing two considerations that are quite different. One is the economic consideration, which is even with a couple of kids, $400,000 is a pretty handsome wage if you're making it. Even with two people, that's a handsome wage. It's an emotional toll. So I grew up. I'm older than you. I grew up in the 1960s. It would have been bizarre if a parent came to watch a game, any kind of game after school. Parents just didn't do that. Dads were at the office. Mothers were in my neighborhood typically at home. They were pursuing adult activities. I think they would come to a school play in the course of a year, but children were left alone. One of my big theories about what's happened is the children, people who are slightly younger than me, the children came of age in the 1970s. Their parents had no idea what kids could get up to after school. And the kids who actually grew up in the 1970s said, we know what children can get up to after school. And we are damn sure that our children are going to be policed every minute of their lives. They'll be sniffing glue. And so the children who grew up in the feral 1970s became the helicopter parents of the 1990s, who knew more about drugs than the kids of the 1990s did, and were like policing their children. But of course that takes a terrible toll. And all I can say to those parents is it's not about how much money you have and how much you're spending. That the main thing I would recommend as a father of three, having learned this the hard way, is it takes a lot of parental neglect to produce a well-balanced child. And that Americans need to learn to neglect their children a little bit more. Let the kids play their games. You don't have to watch. Don't go to the rehearsals for the school play. They'll feel better. You'll feel better.
Well, the problem, though, David, is there's like a culture now of expectations where if you just drop your kids off, you may be judged. I mean, and maybe you're saying do it anyway, but you may be judged by other parents, coaches, and even your own child as
Yes.
being neglectful. And so it's almost an arms race that you have to keep up with the Joneses, not in terms of the money you're bringing in, but in terms of the time you're spending with your kids.
Uh, in our neighborhood in Wesley Heights, Washington, where the biggest danger is cars and the occasional ill-mannered dog. We live 3 blocks from the local public school, and we were when we let our children walk to and from school, beginning in I think the 3rd grade. We were this close constantly to being reported to protective child services. Like, you let your children walk to school, and even if you let them walk with friends. But yeah, I think that's the thing that is making parents. That is, it's an internal thing that conscientious, loving, devoted people do to themselves. Anyway, we're getting a little offbeat here because I'm not in the business of giving parenting tips.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, let me go back to a provocative point you made a few minutes ago. Are you saying that Donald Trump is basically going to stay out of the debt ceiling debate, see how it plays out, and then inevitably, when Republicans uh, create some sort of a crisis, a shutdown or something, then he is going to throw them under the bus
Uh,
and be Mr.
I,
Populist?
I don't predict that as fact. I'm just saying that it's pretty obvious that the Republicans have not been thinking about that problem. And if I were them, I would think about it because Donald Trump's capacity for betrayal is greater than that of any American in politics since Benedict Arnold. And even Benedict Arnold, once he changed sides, he then stayed loyal to the British. He was a very patriotic subject of King George after he made that
Yeah.
switch. And he only flipped. He only changed sides once. So
Yeah, and
that's
that's noble. There's a famous quote. I don't know who it's about, but the line is, "He's the kind of guy that once he gets bought, he stays bought."
right.
So
Well, Trump will flip and flop, and he will just be a wrecking ball. And they need to think about that because Trump's project for the next few months is going to be to just go after and destroy anyone he thinks is any kind of threat to him. Except, I mean, he will patronizingly. He patted Nikki Haley on the head because he doesn't regard her as any kind of serious threat. But he's going to look for ways to destroy DeSantis. He's going to look for ways to destroy Republican leadership in the House and Senate because he needs them broken because he knows how much they hate him. But his goal has been to say, you need to fear me more than you hate me. And one of the ways that he makes them fear him is through his infinite capacity for treachery.
so I have a piece in the Daily Beast about how at some point, and maybe it's 6 months from now, but at some point they're going to have to attack Trump if they're going to beat him. I mean, I just don't
Or just
think.
lose. Or just lose to
Yeah,
him.
exactly. And last time, of course, there was the theory, sort of the Ted Cruz theory, that Trump's just going to fade away and let everyone, take out Rubio or whatever, take out Jeb, and then Trump will fade away, and I will inherit Trump's supporters by sucking up to him. That didn't work out. Do you think that Ron DeSantis or somebody else has learned that lesson, or do you fear that they're going to replay history?
I don't. I think they may have learned that lesson intellectually, but I don't think that what Ted Cruz and the others did in 2016 was truly an intellectual error. That is, they misjudged the best way to handle Trump. I think the truth is they were weak on the inside, and Trump knew that. They were scared, and so then these explanations of this were rationalizations. And now, look, it wasn't that nobody attacked him. Jeb Bush attacked him. They would only attack once they had already realized they were on the path to losing anyway. And so it was a desperation tactic, and it looked like one. And they also attacked him in ways that never made an impact. They would attack him for being insufficiently ideological in ways that, by now it's clear the Republican rank and file do not much care about the nominal ideology of the party. But that's going to be, I think, one of the things that Ron DeSantis has not figured out is what the DeSantis message is. Well, what about if Jeb Bush had been really rude? Would you like a rude Jeb Bush? So it's the same Jeb Bush domestic policy, but whereas Jeb Bush was he was a genuinely decent and kindly person, and he then made that so he put his conservative tilted toward the wealthiest people in society policies within a blanket or within a framework or an appearance of caring and compassion. So, okay, what if we take the same policies and put them not in a veneer of caring and compassion, but in a veneer of sneering and contempt? Would that work better? And I think there are a lot of Republicans who like the sneering and the contempt, but they bump into the fact that, okay, me, the assistant manager here in the Home Hardware in Louisville, Kentucky, what do I get if I vote for this guy? I love the sneering and contempt, but I do notice that my mom, who is on Medicare, just is getting her insulin cheaply. And my kids who are not on Medicare are not getting their insulin cheaply. Do you have anything to say about the insulin problem? And Donald Trump will say anything about insulin, and Ron DeSantis won't. And that's going to be, I think, a structural problem for him.
Interesting. In terms of the fighting, though, um, do you think that DeSantis? I mean, it's so hard to say. We don't really know yet if DeSantis can take a punch, and if he's on a debate stage, if he would be able to go mano a mano with Donald Trump, because Trump isn't just nasty; he's smart and he's quick. He's very quick witted, and they're different skills. Like I think I'd be like, okay, time out. I'm gonna go write a rejoinder to this. Like I'm not sure I could be so quick on the fly, but Trump really actually is good at that.
Trump has the schoolyard bully's instinct for the point of weakness and vulnerability in other human beings. And his opponents had in 2016, had a pre-constituted ideological scheme about where the weaknesses ought to be, and were not perceptive about where they actually were. And we'll see whether DeSantis does better. But the DeSantis strategy really does seem to be wait for Trump to fall apart on his own. But that creates a series of problems. One of Trump's greatest vulnerabilities are his legal challenges. But every time Trump has a legal challenge, DeSantis rallies to him. He did that over the Mar-a-Lago raid. So the very thing that is supposed to be DeSantis's own tool that he wants the job to be done, but he wants to position himself as if he was on Trump's side the whole time. And the problem is he might be successful in his positioning. He might actually succeed in beating back. And it looks like they've done quite a good job of deterring certainly the federal law enforcement authorities from doing anything against Trump. And the state law enforcement authorities are also outside of New York being very, very careful. And we're now deep into 23. This race is going to be locked up pretty soon. The indictment clock has not told.
Well, when you say locked up, do you mean it's essentially locked in, that people will have decided who the nominee is going to be? I think because I think part of what DeSantis is doing, I hope, is waiting till the Florida legislative session is over before he really campaigns in earnest, and he's sort of keeping his powder dry. And I'm okay with that up until a point, but at some point you actually have to. What is it? The Ric Flair, to be the man, you have to beat the man.
Yes.
And he has to beat Trump at some point.
Well, my guess is what we'll say in retrospect about the DeSantis campaign is that his strategy was to win the Republican nomination by taking cultural stances that are basically of zero interest to probably 90% of the population. And it's not even it's not even necessarily that 90% are against him. They said, that his energy is all going into a series of battles that if you are not on conservative websites for 2 hours a day, you can't even understand. I really would like to, I would be very interested in a poll that asked Americans, this thing called critical race theory has been in the news recently. Can you tell me what it is? And I'm guessing that 90% of Americans have no idea. And so if that's going to be the gist of your campaign for the Republican nomination, you have two problems. One is you're talking about things that a lot of Republicans themselves are not going to care about. The less highly online people who vote in primaries, I don't know that they care. And then, of course, you've positioned yourself in a way which is disregarding all the warning signals. And the parallel that I would recommend to the DeSantis people to study. So in 1998, Republicans also had a disappointing mid-year election, driven by the Clinton impeachment. They had one big winner at the state level, and that was George W. Bush, who won 2/3 of the vote when he ran for re-election in Texas, and he broke through with all kinds of groups that Republicans had traditionally not done well before. And Bush had always kept a maximum distance from Gingrich and the others. And the moment he locked in, his first message was that we've seen what compassionate conservatism can do, what being a different kind of conservatism can do. And he, from the moment he secured his own reelection, was triangulating against the unpopular National Party. And the result is history. Now, what DeSantis has done is he had a pretty good reelection. Bush got 67 or 66% of the vote in Texas, and DeSantis got 58 or 59 in Florida. So not as big, but still pretty good. And that was his moment to say, okay, let me remind everyone who's not on townhall.com 4 hours a day or more, Breitbart. Let me remind them why they might be interested in me. And he's it's now about to be February of the year before the election, and he's still talking about, I want to fire all the critical race theory professors in Florida. And what does he have to say about insulin? Who knows?
Well, speaking of issues that you have to be pretty plugged in to follow, Matt Taibbi says the left source for Russian disinformation bots were accounts of, quote, real Americans. This
Yeah.
has to do with this Hamilton 68 project from a think tank, Alliance for Securing Democracy. David, I will tell you this, just totally, this is anecdotal,
Yeah.
but I was, as you know, very active on Twitter in 2014, 2015, 2016. All of a sudden, I was inundated by Twitter feeds that were kind of working the refs.
Yeah.
Basically, these were racist, right wing Twitter feeds that were, I think, amplifying some bad voices on the right
Yeah.
and really going after people like me. I think it partly was to get people like me to quiet down and to be quiet or to quit our jobs. And part of it might have been to make us think, oh my, we're out of touch with where the party is or the country is. We better reevaluate. And then the darndest thing happened, David. After Trump won, they went away. They disappeared. They evaporated. But now we're being told by Matt Taibbi, who I guess has done some sort of study, that that the idea that these were Russian bots is false. What's the truth?
Well, the very first thing to understand is Matt Taibbi has done no kind of study, not on this subject, not I think at any point in his life. That I think on this case, the corporate PR team at the new Twitter has put things together in a box and gift wrapped them and handed to him, and he's now, as he himself will say, these come from third party sources. I'm not verifying them. Things may have been left out. I just print what I'm told. Okay, that's the kind of journalist I am. People tell me stuff. I believe. If I like them, I believe them. I don't ask any questions. I just post it. But the latest round of these, so many of the so-called Twitter revelations have been such. But this round has been spectacular because the big reveal. A think tank claims that a lot of the pro-Putin, pro-Trump messages on Twitter were produced by bots inspired by Russian sources. Our claim is they were not produced by bots. They were produced by real, authentic human assholes. You think, okay, I have, you've got the metrics, or whoever is feeding Taibbi's stuff has got the metrics. Okay, turns out there were real live human assholes. Well, that's actually not reassuring, because you thought there are things that, like in the old joke about the lab rats, there are things that even a rat won't do. I thought there are things you had to get a bot to do. It turns out, no, there were people who were willing to do that. And it turns out maybe they weren't even paid. Maybe they were doing it for free because they were that nasty.
I have a hard time believing it, David. I'm just telling you again, anecdotally, as someone who was on the receiving and inundated with these tweets for years, and then they just went away. It
But
really, in hindsight, it really feels coordinated.
yes. But the point is, if the big reveal is it wasn't as automated as the people thought, that it may be that there's a kind of mirror imaging going on. Is that because people who are good at technology assume that everyone else is equally good at technology, and they see coordinated activity, and the idea that it's just like, a network of human losers in their basement spending 18 hours a day manually retweeting this stuff, in a very inefficient way. Maybe that's what happened. I don't know. I actually don't. But the thing that I find sort of remarkable about the Hamilton is that they think they've got a sympathetic story when they say, no, all this poisonous sludge was you think it was mass produced by bots? No, it's artisanally handcrafted by people. And And by the one of the things that he's inserted here is the claim that they are Americans, and that even that is, I think, a completely stolen base. This is done by real live Americans. We don't know they were Americans, and it's doubtful they were. They were because there are networks of these group people all over the world. They find each other, and they're in all kinds of countries. As remember that QAnon was run out of the Philippines by an American expat, I believe, but still, that was the center. It was in the Philippines. So it's a global economy, but. The fact is that you've got that there is this effort to portray spreading anti-vax lies, pro-Putin lies, justifying Trump, engaging in anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, engaging in racist bills. These are activities that are somehow sympathetic. Now, many of these activities are protected by the First Amendment. I'm not saying they're illegal. Obviously, for many, it is not against the law to be an anti-Semitic nutcase. But you can well understand why a responsible corporation would say, if you walk into a Hyatt hotel with a T-shirt that says "Kill the Jews," the manager may ask you to leave. And if you say, "Well, I have a right to wear this T-shirt," yeah, you do, but not in my coffee shop. Thank you very much. So please go get your cup of coffee at the drive-through window. And that in effect is what some of these social media platforms decided to do after 2014 or 15. They said, my God, this was supposed to emancipate human creativity and empower conversations and allow little kids to play chess with each other across international borders. And instead, we've empowered these Nazis. No, thank you. Not in our coffee shop.
I mean, like I'm looking at a Fox News story about this, and it's being portrayed as like these are American conservatives who had hashtags like quote, not quote, like pound, fire McMaster, release the memo, stand with Laura, things like that. That's not what we're talking about here.
Well, as I say, they may be authentic human persons, as it may have been artisanally done, but as I say, that's no credit to those authentic artisanal people. It is the claim that they were Americans really needs to be not allowed to pass unexamined because it is a global network. But I don't know what you think you've accomplished once you've shown these things that you said were bots. We think actually they're human beings who are acting for their own malicious reasons. Okay. I get it. It was
that's not a great.
It was less automated than the smart people at the German Marshall Fund thought it was.
Yeah, not a great defense. I'm still skeptical, but but I'm not going to like launch a conspiracy theory about it. I don't care that much. And you're right. Either way, it's an indictment. So let's move on to something that is even worse, even worse. Which was the attack, David, on Paul Pelosi. The video, if for those out there who haven't seen it, there's a video who shows this guy breaking into the Pelosi's home, and then B, essentially you can see him hitting Paul Pelosi over the head with a hammer super hard. Like if you thought, well, maybe he just tapped him, like, no. I'm astonished that a guy who's 82 years old survived that blow. In fact, I think it would have killed most people. I don't know, maybe because the police happened to be there. That's how we have the video. It was a body cam, I think, that captured the assault. And so obviously the response was very quick. But still, it is astonishing to me. And of course, David, we had people who were joking about it and then making all sorts of innuendo about it. And now we have, I hope, evidence about what really happened. But I don't know if anyone's going to learn any lessons from this.
Yeah. Well, I wonder about the psychology of people who look. The United States has a terrible tradition of political violence. One of the things that is sort of distinctive about the American tradition of political violence is that the people who do the violence are themselves not usually all that political. That John Hinckley didn't have political motives when he went after Ronald Reagan. There does seem to be a special American culture of disturbed people who, maybe because we're a less cohesive society, I don't know, but they project their mental turbulence on some public figure and go after that person. And in the past generation, the security around the president has improved so much that they tend not to attack the president. They attack other kinds of figures. And they attack them irrespective of party. They attacked Steve Scalise, who was an important, I think he was the number 2 or 3 Republican in the House at the time that he was shot. They attacked Gabby Giffords. Again, that person had no political motive and was mentally unstable. And it looks like the person who attacked Paul Pelosi he had a kind of deranged political motive, but he's obviously, he's got fragments of QAnon mania in his head, but it's not like he's an otherwise functional human being. He's a dysfunctional human being who then glommed onto this piece of ideology. So this is something that is a classic American tragedy, and one that your first reaction is should just be one of human sympathy. And your second one is to question, are we providing enough security for people at the next level below the president? And one of the things that there are some gaps, and maybe the Speaker of the House and similar kinds of people, and including the Supreme Court people who, by the way, have faced dangers. Maybe we need to be rethinking the level of security that is provided to that next tier below the president. That would be a good discussion to have. And you don't want to turn them into prisoners where that nobody on the Supreme Court can ever go out for dinner alone. But okay, that's a good discussion to have. And then, what is it? And then the sociologist what is it about American society that you do seem to have these lone oddballs who project their distemper onto? But what happened instead was horrible. And it continued. And it wasn't just these lone Hamilton 68 weirdos on the internet. The owner of Twitter became party to this. And you just think, what's wrong with you? How could you? And even if you think that the first reports on a story are not complete, the first reports on a story are never complete, like why do you have that impulse to say, that guy was hammered in the head, I think I need to kick his wife too?
Yeah. Well, right after this happened, I was talking to a friend of mine who was convinced that Pelosi had been involved in a homosexual liaison with this guy. And I said, I don't think that's true, but if that turns out to be true, it's really going to question a lot of my worldview, because all of these conspiracies require a conspiratorial mindset, which distrusts what the police say, distrusts what the media reports, and of course, there's always the fog of war. Yeah. Anytime there's like a crazy mass shooting or something, details will change. But if in fact this is being cast as, I'm a believer in sort of the reality world, and if it turns out later that I am being duped, and in fact I'm going to have to reevaluate everything, because maybe everything I've heard is not true, and maybe we can't believe anything.
Yeah.
And then I kind of forgot about it. This reaffirms the reality-based world, David, is what I'm saying.
Yeah. So look, it's often true that first reports on incidents are inaccurate, misleading. People think they saw 2 gunmen. There was really only one. They think the gunman arrived in a van. In fact, he arrived on foot. There was a different van that had nothing to do with it. People are scared. People are upset. The police are collecting statements. The police don't have time to talk to you. It's true that the first reports from the AP and other reputable sources will often be, somewhat wrong. But it's a different thing to say. So I was talking on the internet with some guy in the Philippines, and he had a theory. And then this becomes like the thing about the conspiracy. It isn't that they are distrusting; it's they are the biggest gullible suckers in the world. I have to say, one of the things that I have taken away from watching Elon Musk on Twitter is I would never invest in. The guy will believe anything. He has no protection against obvious flim-flam. Like, you want me to entrust my capital to this guy, the world's most gullible human being? And he's obviously not the world's most gullible human being. There's other people who are equally gullible. But that the conspiratorial mindset is one where you believe nothing except the ridiculous. And then you
Yeah.
believe, if it's crazy, then you believe anything. So, uh, the idea that the Air Force says, we think this bright object moving across the sky was probably a weather balloon. So the Air Force always lies. So what's your theory? I think secret aliens from across the galaxy. And what is your basis for this? I read it on a website.
There's a real,
Like
I
I
feel it's
can
like a
understand
lack
not
of,
believing the Air Force, but I can understand that. I personally tend to believe they tell the truth more often than not, but they don't tell the truth 100% of the time. And sometimes they're genuinely, are authentically wrong, and sometimes they deceive. But the idea that you are believing just anything you read on the internet anywhere, provided it's written by someone who's obviously got mental health issues, you're gullible.
that's
That's
the
your
criteria, right? Now, I feel like there's a lack of wisdom, a lack of prudence, and a lack of critical thinking. And there are plenty of really smart people who don't have any of those things. And that's what's weird, is that we tend to attribute, along with intelligence and success, especially financial success, other virtues, and oftentimes they're not there.
and I'll say this is a point I'm sensitive to. Once you develop a conspiratorial mindset, you need to think who's behind the conspiracy. Someone has to be there. If there's a mastermind, there has to be a mastermind. And it's almost impossible that that will not lead you toward anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is because the difference in anti-Semitism and other forms of racism. Most forms of racism are founded ultimately in contempt. A misogyny and anti-black racism and anti-Chinese racism, they're all founded at some level of a sense of superiority on the person, unfounded, of course, but unfounded superiority on the part of the racist, and contempt for the target of disdain. And anti-Semitism is different. It is not founded on contempt. It's founded on paranoia. And and so if you're a paranoid person, you're ultimately, at least if you descend from Western culture, maybe in other societies where you don't have the history of Christian-Jewish relations that the post-Christian societies have, but not, maybe this is not how it is in China, but it is this way in Japan. That ultimately you come across the ultimate conspiracy run by the Jews. And I'm very mindful of something that happened when, why did Glenn Beck get taken off the air by Fox News in 2011? He had a show at 5 o'clock that was the most successful cable TV show in that hour ever. And Glenn Beck was promoting wilder and wilder conspiracy theories. Now, he himself never said anything anti-Semitic, and I don't believe he is any kind of anti-Semite. But when he would do those boards with the motors and at some point we needed somebody inside the box, inside the box, inside the box. We needed somebody to go in there. And what's the spark plug that is going to drive this motor? And it's always turns out to be the same one.
George
As somebody had
Soros.
called it, yeah, the world's most boring detective story. The criminal is always the same. And I think that they had a sense of, we can see where this is going, and we better stop him before he gets there, even though he himself is not. As I said, I don't want to make this a personal accusation, but he's driving on a track that leads to a certain destination. And I think there is, you see this on the internet, that there's a kind of weird thing that happens, that people, they start off denying that Assad is using chemical weapons in Syria, and then they're led to believing that COVID is a hoax, and then they're led to something else. But and whether they start on the left or on the right, they always converge on a common destination: rejection of democratic institutions, distrust of the fact-finding process, and usually some form of conspiratorial anti-Semitism.
Well, I didn't prep you on this question, but I think it's something of a segue, and then we'll call it a day. Pat Buchanan has retired his syndicated column. Um, I know I don't know how well you know Pat. I know that you guys have been
Yeah.
involved in some controversies in the past. But I have to tell you, I've always found Pat to be incredibly friendly and nice in person. And I've always found him to be a really good sort of pundit, kind of a happy warrior that I just think is fun to watch on TV. But he obviously has also been accused of anti-Semitism and racism and other things like that. I disagree with a lot of his politics. I can tell you, like, he wrote a piece asking if Vladimir Putin is one of us now, I think in 2013 or 2014. As he has retired his column, what is your take on the impact of Pat Buchanan?
Well, the impact has been enormous. And in the days when I started writing about him, I read about him in the 1992 uh, primary when he challenged the elder Bush in New Hampshire and did surprisingly well. He lost, but he did surprisingly well. Um, and look, the mixture of trade protectionism and refusal to protect America's democratic allies and admiration for foreign dictators and racial contempt and anti-Semitic paranoia. He didn't invent that. I always thought that was a recessive strain in American conservatism. And the thing I think a lot of the things I look back on and I I think they stand up. But the one thing I wrote, especially from the 1990s, that got wrong is I thought this was something that ultimately was going to be a weaker form of conservatism, and it turned out to be the strongest. And so, in that sense, Pat Buchanan can look back on a career with great satisfaction, which is he ultimately his brand of conservatism prevailed, and mine did not. Now, when he writes of Vladimir Putin, is he one of us? I think he's sort of betraying his vanity and narcissism. Pat, he's not one of you. You're one of him.
Oh, all right. On that note, we shall end it. David, how can people read your stuff and follow you on Twitter?
Well, please come to the Atlantic. Actually a lot of the Atlantic. It's often like a bus route where you send the buses out at regular intervals, but they do tend to bunch up. So I've got like 3 articles coming out over the next 4 days that were not written, obviously, in 3 and 4 days. So I've got an article on Trump betrayal coming up. I've got an article on the tendency of Republicans to take up trolling instead of politics. That's in the print magazine. I've got a big piece based on some reporting I did from Mexico over the month of January. So please come to the Atlantic and read those. And at David Frum on Twitter. And I'm more active on Facebook these days as well because I'm preparing for the worst to happen with Twitter.
Always better to be prepared. David Frum, always a pleasure. Thank you for coming back on the news.
Thank you.